Hi, I'm John.
Hi. So we have time for a couple questions if anyone has anything.
I better think of something.
You better think of something.
During the campaign, Andrew Scheer had brought up that he was concerned about that language within UNDRIP for, prior and informed.
Free, prior, and informed consent. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
No worries.
How, in the legislation you brought in British Columbia, how do you intend to deal with the big infrastructure projects that have to go through, first indigenous lands that will respect UNDRIP but still allow the development of business?
Well, the current situation prior to the implementation of our legislation was litigation, confrontation, and ultimately failure to move forward on a number of projects. UNDRIP allows us to start from a different place in discussions around industrial activity. I made reference in my remarks today to fish farms in coastal waters in British Columbia. Very contentious issue, not unlike how Eastern Canadians would understand the pipeline questions when it comes to British Columbians' desire to defend our coast and the desire of Alberta and other provinces to get their commodities to higher priced markets. Those are economic questions. Those are questions of industrial development. And they should include all participants in that debate. We have environmental assessment legislation in British Columbia, have had so for 30 years. There's federal legislation with respect to what procedures companies and investment has to take to proceed with the project. Having in place a declaration of the rights of the inherent title holders of the land is just another addition to the processes that are already in place. Without UNDRIP, litigation was the way forward for investment, and we've seen that with the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Court case after court case after court case, when in fact the better way forward is to sit down, investment sitting down with the title holders, those who have title to the land, and that's been established by court precedents that will fill this room. The Supreme Court's made it abundantly clear that rights and title exist in British Columbia. Our approach was, rather than confrontation, rather than litigation, let's have a path forward for investment. Let's have a way forward for economic prosperity for all British Columbians. And the fish farm example that I used in my remarks was the first time that the investors in that activity had an opportunity to sit down with equal partners at a table to determine the way forward. And we've seen success. We've seen an outcome that it meets the needs of Indigenous communities as well as investment. And I believe that can happen in example after example when you start from a place of partnership rather than a place of confrontation.
What do you say to people who have concerns that things...
Oh, thank you. No problem. What do you say to people who have concerns that this legislation that enacts UNDRIP will in fact hold up development of projects, delay investment? What do you say to those skeptics, let's say?
Well, in the 28 months that I've been Premier of British Columbia, we were able to sit down with natural gas companies, the whole sector, and say, look, we have an abundance of this commodity in our territory. How do we get it out of the ground? How do we get it to higher price markets? The U.S. market has disappeared because of an abundance of gas in North America. So the obvious solution was to get the gas to another market. That means transporting it through pipelines to the coast, liquefying it, and getting it out to other markets. So we were able to, working with Indigenous people, working with investment, land the largest private sector investment in Canadian history. The LNG Canada project is a $40 billion investment that addressed Indigenous rights and title, addressed environmental assessment, and also put in place a foundation for future prosperity for the people that along which the territory of the pipeline will occupy. That's a solution to, that's my answer to the question of what about the future? Well, the past was not shining with examples of success. Court case after court case stopped projects, slowed projects, delayed projects. Now those discussions can happen as equals rather than as litigants. And I think that's the solution, and that's what we're so excited about unanimously in the British Columbia legislature, which is not known for Greens, New Democrats, and Liberals coming together, but every member of the legislature voted in favor of this at the end of the day because it's a better way forward than our past.
As the federal government moves towards, we know that Mr. Trudeau has said UNDRIP legislation from the Liberal Party would come into the House in Ottawa. What lessons did you learn that you might share with federal officials as they move forward down that path?
Well, I've talked to the Prime Minister since his election. I've talked to Chrystia Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Intergovernmental Relations, and at the front of my list was I had a minority government. He has a minority government. We took bold action to make progress for investment, for human rights, and for the prosperity of British Columbians. And at the end of the day, with the passage of the bill, it was unanimously supported. So I encourage the Prime Minister to take that leap of faith and to call on Mr. Shearer and those skeptics and say, what's your solution? How would you make it better? In British Columbia, we're demonstrating that we can have rigid and enforceable environmental assessment procedures. We can have discussions about partnerships with Indigenous peoples and still have the lowest unemployment rate in the country, balanced budgets, AAA credit ratings, and growth that's beyond that in other jurisdictions. So I believe you can walk and chew gum at the same time. And if you reach out to partnerships rather than say, well, I prefer to stick with my confrontation, my litigation, and eventually no project, then that's your solution. Carry on. I think that Mr. Shearer, Mr. Singh, and Mr. Trudeau should sit down together and figure out a way forward in the interests of all Canadians. That's what we've done in British Columbia, and I know they can do it here too.
And why do you think there were these skeptics? What did you do to try and bring people on board?
Well, we talked to people. We had the support of the BC Business Council. That's a collection of the largest employers, the biggest companies in British Columbia, the mining sector, the forestry sector, the oil and gas sector. These are large industrial sectors within British Columbia that have been the backbone of our provincial economy. And all of those investors, all of those corporate leaders recognized that litigation was not getting them anywhere. It was just leading to yet another, every other day there would be another challenge to a project. Best way forward, let's sit down with the title holders whose land we want to conduct economic activity and create partnerships in a way forward. That worked with the business community, that worked with the opposition, that worked with Indigenous peoples, and that also works for the people of British Columbia. We see a bright future for everyone, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and I encourage Canada and other provinces to do it as well. Each jurisdiction will have a different approach. British Columbia is largely unceded territory. We don't have a lot of treaties. We don't. The land has been unoccupied. The Crown just assumed it was theirs, and the courts have said, no, you can't do that. And that's, as I say, a room full of litigation has determined that. Case law says best course of action, talk to each other, and so that's what we're doing.
All right, thanks everyone.
Can I throw one more at you?
Sure.
Because you did bring up Trans Mountain, and as it's
I kind of thought you did, but that's okay.
well, you mentioned it.
Yeah, of course I did, yeah.
But so where's the government of British Columbia stand now? I mean, there's still some court
Yeah.
proceedings that needs to unfold,
Yeah.
but it does seem that the project is still one the government wants to push forward.
The federal government, yes, yeah.
Where's the government of British Columbia stand on the project as it is now?
Well, we entered into, when we formed government, there was existing court actions. We entered into those proceedings. Most of them have run their course. In the course of our time as government, we saw an opportunity to put in place stricter regulations to protect our natural environment, to protect those parts of our economy that could be compromised by a catastrophic oil spill. Defending our coast was part of our election commitment. It was also part of our fabric as British Columbians. It's our coast because we live there, but it's a Canadian coast and it's precious to all Canadians, and we feel an obligation to do whatever we can to make sure that it is safe. So the federal government came forward with an ocean protection plan. I talked to the Prime Minister and said, good start. That's a very good start, but there are 3 coasts, the largest coastline on the planet, and the dollars committed and the plan for action was inadequate in my mind, and we continue to work with the federal government to improve the ocean protection plan. We're also at the Supreme Court next month or February about a reference case with respect to who has jurisdiction over regulating any commodity, any dangerous commodity, not just diluted bitumen, but whatever would come through from Alberta or from the other parts of Canada to our coasts. Our ports are very vibrant. They're the gateway to Canada. They're the gateway to the Pacific economy. And we want to make sure that continues to be robust. But we also want to ensure that we have the ability to protect those things that are important. So that reference case will be heard in the next month or two. and that will be our response to the litigation so far. There are Indigenous peoples who are still in court with Trans Mountain. We're not participating in those cases.
But if the project is to go through as is, unchanged, would the province of British Columbia again try to take the federal government to court over objections of environmental safety issues that you talked
Yeah, well, we believe that the court cases have run, our participation in the litigation has run its course, save and except our reference case, which is not just about Trans Mountain, it's about how do we protect all of the interests of British Columbians. The BNA Act and the Constitution Act of 1982 did not contemplate comprehensively environment as a jurisdiction, who has authority. There's been numerous cases that have come forward over the years. This is one of many. And I believe a relevant one. Some would argue about that. Those who believe that it's just about Trans Mountain are missing the point. We believe that British Columbia and other provinces have the right to put in place regulations to protect their communities and their people and their land. And we'll see what the Supreme Court has to say about that. But the other litigation, there's, I believe, a federal court case that the Tsleil-Waututh and a number of other Indigenous people along the Trans Mountain corridor are still proceeding with. We're not part of that litigation. Great. Thanks, everybody. Go Canucks.